Well, the VA fix is supposedly in, but will the just-passed bill help government unions more than our veterans? Hi, everybody. I'm David Asman. Welcome to Forbes on Fox. Let's go in focus with, what's his name again? Oh, yes, Steve Forbes is back, along with Mike Ozanian, Elizabeth McDonald, Sabrina Schaefer, Rick Unger, and John Tamney. So, Steve, good to have you back. Is this fix designed more for unions than our vets?
To ask the question is to answer it. Of course it was for the unions. The reforms in the bill, David, are phony. It's a typical government response. Spend more money. The more you fail, the more money you get, the bigger you get. And in terms of choice for the veterans, it's severely restricted. In terms of the secretary being able to fire, there are restrictions in there that make it not less than what it's supposed to be. So the whole thing is a sham, an expensive sham. And these politicians and unions are like vampires feasting on our veterans. It is a disgrace.
Wow. Rick, what do you think?
Well, no, I mean, look, on the union question, I'm not quite sure how you say that, considering the fact that the bill does give the secretary the power to fire officials that happen to be union members. And I support that, by the way. I'm all for getting rid of anybody in the VA who's doing a bad job. As for the bill itself, there are some problems. I would never go as far as Steve has with it because I think it's a step forward. But I do think there were some better ways to fix these problems, which hopefully will still emerge.
Sabrina, by the way, it's a very mild pushback on the part of the ability of the head of the VA to be able to fire union members. But the real key, I think, is what Steve focused on, outsourcing, whether vets who are not getting the assistance they need from the VA can go outside of the VA. There are a lot of restrictions on their ability to do that because the unions don't want them to go outside the VA.
Right. No, you're right, and Steve is right that this is a typical response, government response. It's the exact same approach we take to our public education system in this country. The problem is not a lack of resources or funds. It's the lack of a marketplace. There's no opportunity for real competition of price, competition of care, and there's no outside motivating factor. So to tell a veteran who's been waiting for too long of a wait period that they can now go out and seek out private care is like telling a parent who's had a kid in a failing school for 3 or 4 years that now they can look for a private option. I'm sorry, but that is too little, too late.
And amazing, the unions are pretty upfront about their opposition to it. The head of the AFGE, which is the biggest union representative, I think, by the way, 2/3 of the VA is unionized and about 80% is under this particular union. He said contracting out veterans care should be used on a very limited basis. So they're admitting they don't want vets to be able to do this.
Of course, what they've basically done with this bill, David, is they created a new entitlement program that, if scored correctly, in fact, how it was scored in its earlier version before some accounting gimmickry, is going to cost $500 billion over the next 10 years. And as Sabrina pointed out, does not even address the problems.
And, John, 2/3 of the employees are unionized. We all remember even FDR was against part of the unionization of public workers. This is why. The individuals who are supposed to be helped don't get the help they need if it's against the union's interests.
Yeah, we want to help the veterans, so anything that keeps them inside the VA is going to hurt them. We like to talk about government as soft and compassionate, but the reality is that government is long lines, it's inefficiency, it's surly service. So if we want to help the veterans, we should let them get out. We should turn their benefits into dollars that they can spend on profit-motivated health care.
But, EMAC, as we've seen, the unions don't want them to outsource.
Yeah, they don't. And, you know, the storyline now from the federal unions at the VA is that, you know, you're going to it's really wrong what they're saying. They're saying, oh, you know, VA veterans are going to end up at, you know, local community hospitals who don't know how to treat PTSD, not understanding that the veterans would have the choice of what hospital they would go to. They don't have to go to that local community. This is the problem, David. Nearly 270 VA full-time workers, guess what they do? They work on union duties full-time. That's their job, is working for the union. These are physicians' assistants and nurses in states across the country. So they have no standing to argue against, you know, veterans getting the choice to get better care outside the network.
And Steve, let's just out exactly how the unions have made it difficult to outsource. First, if you want to outsource, first you have to prove you've waited longer than the VA considers reasonable, that you live 40 miles from a VA facility. Then you have to be put on a VA waiting list, and you know all those veterans who've called waiting for hours, days, months, and not getting a call back. On top of this, any civilian doctor you see has to call a VA hotline for prior approval. And then if you manage to get outside care, you can only stay with that doctor for 60 days. I mean, they've made it almost impossible to outsource.
Yeah, it's a soundbite, but as soon as you go beyond the soundbite, you see that the whole thing is a sham. And the union has an agreement with the VA, 316 pages long. The work rules are crushing. The doctors have very little ability to have flexibility with the nurses and assistants. And so I think the poor guy, McDonald, who's taking over the VA as secretary, is going to have the shock of his life when he finds out he's secretary, but he has very little power.
Rick?
Yeah, look, there are some problems. I agree with that. I think some of you are very much overstating it. I will, however...
I just read what the law says.
But let me bring something to everybody's attention that I think you should be aware of. Dr. Richard Carmona, who was the Surgeon General in the Bush administration, has come up with an idea for a surge at the VA, which is really nothing short of brilliant. You need to tune in to what he's thinking. Basically, what he wants to do is get the VA working 24 hours a day, which is doable. Forget about going outside because, you know, people are going to run into the same problems we all do with outside medicine, which is you have to wait to get an appointment. They need to be able to get in there now. Activate people in the National Guard who do their weekend duty. Train these clerks to be able to take some of the VA overflow.
Okay.
He's got a great plan.
All right, Sabrina, Sabrina, this doesn't give people a choice if they're not getting what they need from the VA. And we've seen Republicans and Democrats fail to give veterans what they need from the VA.
And it all comes back to the unions. Look, public support for unions has been dropping precipitously in the last few years, and it's because the public perceives unions as, you know, thinking of their own interests ahead of others, whether it's veterans or civilians. This is exactly the same. Not to go back to the school system, but this is why we don't have choice and competition in the school system. This is why we don't have choice and competition in health care. That is what it comes down to. There may be little fixes like Rick is suggesting on the margins, but we need a complete overhaul where you have real competition of choice in care and price.
And Mike, our kids and our veterans, what more precious commodities do we have than those?
Absolutely, David. That's the real tragedy. And when it comes to votes in this country, this legislation is going to hurt the Republicans more than the Democrats. You expect this from the Democratic Party. But when mainstream Republicans vote for this piece of garbage, what choice are we giving voters in this country?
Emac, that's a great point. Why did some Republicans sign on to this?
That's a great point. I'm not sure why. I have to research that. But I'll tell you something. When you look at what the VA, you got to read what the union workers at the VA are saying. They're saying that the VA overall created this crisis just to outsource and wreck the VA. Now, that is sort of, you know, let's circle the wagons mentality that federal unions have got to stop behaving like. They work for us. They work for the veterans. They work for the soldiers. They work for taxpayers. They don't work for themselves.
John Tamney, you'd never know it when you look at legislation like this.
I think it even goes well beyond the unions. We've got to remember that if you're talented as a doctor or administrator, odds are you don't work for the VA. And so if we want to help the veterans, we should free them up and let them go outside of it.
Steve, is this ever going to change?
Eventually it will, but not with this Congress and not this administration. It's going to take a new president, a new Congress, and then we'll finally get a real choice and no more of these work rules and really feasting off of veterans. This is an absolute disgrace.
Well, the more we know, the more I love my dog. Let me just put it that way. I mean, this is a disgrace. Our veterans deserve better than this. Coming up next, as the battle